A few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later, then by sheer coincidence, the next morning, montage. The next morning, many tic-tacs later, flashback, and a flashback. The very next evening. Moments later, more moments later, 1 semester later, graduation day. 15 minutes later, several months later, thousands of tears later, 16 paranoia-filled days later, 6 hours later, later that same evening, several days, tomorrow, 2,000 years later, a few moments later, 1 hour later, the next day, 3 hours later, 2 hours later, 6 hours later, tomorrow, hours later, a few inches later, day 2, day 3, day 4, a few moments later, 1 eternity later, 3 days later, 12 seconds later, 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later, many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow for sure. Eventually, 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later, 2 hours later, 8:01 p.m. the next day. Later, 20 minutes later, 6 hours later, later that same evening, several days later, 6 months later, 2 hours later, 1 minute 37 seconds later, 1 debt to society later, 4 to 6 weeks later, 1 pair of pants later, 8 hours later, 298 frozen patties later, 3 hours later, the next day, 10 seconds later, 346 minutes later, much later, 3 days later, opening night.